Come settle in. Tonight, we will drift into a familiar topic, the world of sleep. Or, to be more precise, the way medieval people slept, which you may find is far stranger than most of us could ever imagine. Before you become too relaxed, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I am sharing. I would also be delighted to know where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always a pleasure to see our community connecting from all over the world. Now, please dim your lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft, gentle hum, and let us begin tonight's journey together. Long before the era of electricity, social media, and sleep hygiene experts, people in the Middle Ages approached the night with a routine that would confuse any modern sleep enthusiast. Their method was known as segmented sleep, a natural, two-part sleep cycle, divided neatly in half like a piece of stale medieval bread. The practice was quite simple. Most people would go to bed early after the sun went down, falling into what they called their first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they would intentionally wake up and spend the next hour or two doing what could only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This was not seen as insomnia. It was simply the natural way sleep worked. This waking period, known as the watch, was considered a practical and useful time, and sometimes a surprisingly social one. People used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend to the fire, or check on their farm animals, because nothing interrupts your rest quite like wondering if your goat has wandered off. And yes, this interval was also seen as the best time for intimacy. Medieval doctors and marriage guides noted that the body was well rested and the mind was calm during this period, which sounds like a polite way of saying everyone was too tired to argue. So, if you have ever felt romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know that your ancestors were setting a very different kind of standard. The second sleep would come after this break, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from devout monks to hardworking farmers followed this nightly rhythm. Even famous writers like Chaucer mentioned it in their work, confirming that fragmented sleep was a common topic even in medieval literature. Interestingly, modern science suggests that segmented sleep might actually be a more natural pattern for humans. The two-sleep cycle is closely aligned with how our internal clocks function without artificial light. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 in the morning, do not worry. Just whisper to yourself, "Ah, the watch has begun," and go tend to a symbolic fire. It was not until the Industrial Revolution, with its factories, gas lighting, and a growing fear of being unproductive, that society began to push the idea of 8 continuous hours of sleep, as if rest were a competitive sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night was not a problem. It was just part of the schedule, and everyone followed it whether they wanted to or not. Let's discuss beds, or more accurately, the medieval version of them. In our modern world, we fixate on thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress feels like sleeping on a cloud. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of organic matter that used to be alive, now flattened by the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant's bed was a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a simple sack made of rough cloth, if they were lucky enough to have a sack. If not, it was just straw piled directly on the floor, which was possibly damp and might have already been claimed by a cat. These pallets were not comfortable, but they were much better than nothing, which was the other common option. Straw was cheap, easy to find, and offered some insulation against the cold. It was also a perfect home for insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, turning sleep into an exercise in staying very still. If you felt an itch, you ignored it. If something bit you, you just shifted a little and hoped for the best. If a family had a bit more money, they might raise the straw mattress onto a simple wooden frame. This did not significantly change the sleeping experience, but it did slightly reduce the chances of waking up with bugs in your ear. Linens were a rare luxury. Most people slept in the same clothes they had worn all day. Pajamas were not a common concept, and neither was personal space. Entire families, children, parents, and maybe even a grandparent, all slept together in the same room, sometimes on the very same pile of straw. If you got too warm, you could always roll over and bump into your cousin. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Large wooden frames, soft feather mattresses, beautifully embroidered sheets, and elegant canopies to keep out drafts and, with any luck, the ever-present lice. These beds were so valuable that they were specifically listed in wills. You did not inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most medieval people, a bed was not a place of comfort. It was mainly a place to avoid freezing, to stay away from the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of one day being rich enough to sleep on something that did not rustle or squawk. When we hear the term nightcap, today we usually think of a cozy alcoholic drink, perhaps something with whiskey, enjoyed by a warm fire, often before making a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was not a drink. It was literally a hat. It was a real, physical, and often rather silly-looking piece of cloth designed to keep your head from freezing while you slept. You see, insulation was not a strong point of medieval buildings. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled paper offered little protection from the cold. And as for central heating, that was usually just a dog. So, to keep their heads warm at night, especially since a lot of body heat escapes through the scalp, medieval people wore the humble nightcap. These hats came in various shapes and sizes, but the most well-known version was long and pointed, looking like something a wizard who works as a chimney sweep might wear. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever piece of warm fabric could be found without upsetting the family goat. For men, it was a practical item. For women, it sometimes served as a coif or head wrap, which also had the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and hiding hair that had not been washed since last Lent. Beyond just providing warmth, nightcaps also had social meaning. In some areas, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, even while they were sleeping. The cap itself could be beautifully embroidered or dyed to show a family's wealth or social status, because nothing says, "I'm successful," quite like going to bed with a tiny flag on your head. In cities, the nightcap even became a common symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door while wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not available for conversation." And yes, this hat does mean go away. Of course, nightcaps were often worn with nightshirts, which were basically long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the ghost-induced moral awakening. Sleepwear was not meant to be attractive, but it was certainly practical, often itchy, and sometimes flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is usually limited to long-haul flights, ambitious camping trips, or a strange Airbnb situation. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal and not something you could opt out of. Let's say you are a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to the next town. You manage to find an inn, which is a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a private room or your own bed, or even a particularly clean spot on the floor. What you get is a designated space in a bed that is already full of people. Medieval inns were more like human dormitories than modern hotels. Privacy was not an expectation. If a bed had room, you were expected to share it, usually with complete strangers who might snore loudly, talk in their sleep, or have a concerning number of boils. This was not considered rude. It was just an efficient use of limited resources. Beds could hold 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, depending on their size and the general level of tolerance. In larger cities, you might find yourself in a large hall filled with rows of beds and absolutely no personal space. Snoring contests were not judged. Getting elbow room was a constant struggle. Sometimes men and women were given separate sleeping areas, but not always. Some inns tried to assign beds by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and, supposedly, thieves with other thieves. But often, it was just first come, first served. And while this might sound like a nightmare to us today, back then it was a big improvement over sleeping outside with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant revolt. Worried about being robbed, many travelers slept with their money purse tied securely to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their belongings, turning their luggage into both a pillow and a makeshift alarm system. If someone tried to move your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The wealthy, of course, did not have to deal with this. Nobles traveled with large groups of attendants and either camped in relative comfort or simply demanded their own private rooms, as long as the innkeeper valued their roof and their business. In the medieval world, going to bed was not just about pulling up a blanket and falling asleep. It was a serious spiritual event, a nightly gamble where your eternal soul was at stake. People did not just sleep. They carefully prepared for the possibility of dying. This is why bedtime prayers were so popular. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers ended their day with heartfelt confessions, solemn psalms, and spiritual clauses to cleanse their souls, just in case they passed away sometime between good night and sunrise. The idea behind this was simple. You could die at any moment, from a sudden illness, a fire, a demon, or most dangerously, from just being over 30 in the year 1247. So you had better say your prayers. Not because it was comforting, but because the idea of hell was terrifying, and you certainly did not want to show up there uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually unprepared. One common version of these prayers began, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." It sounds sweet, right? Except it is basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old, openly acknowledging that death is a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole list of prayers for different possible threats. One for when you felt guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters, and one to prevent the plague, which unfortunately did not prove to be very effective. Some even prayed to specific saints who were known for watching over sleepers, like holy security guards for your soul. The truly devout, monks, nuns, and very anxious nobles, ended their day with Compline, the final group prayer service before bed. After Compline, they had to observe a strict vow of silence, which was not too difficult since everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and a little afraid of the dark. Children were also strongly encouraged to pray, partly for the good of their souls, and partly to give them something to think about other than why the dog was in their bed again. Parents often told them that angels were watching, which sounds nice until you realize it was less. Guardian angel, and more. Celestial surveillance. In short, prayer before sleep was less about finding inner peace and more about last-minute spiritual damage control. Think of it as medieval antivirus software. You just hoped it worked even if you did not fully understand how. In the modern world, dreams are usually seen as random nonsense, signs of stress, the result of eating too much cheese late at night, or just your brain trying to organize its thoughts in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very, very seriously. As in, eternal consequences. Seriously, dreams were not just dreams. They were considered direct messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or maybe that strange relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were seen as divine revelations. Others were seen as demonic temptations. Either way, you were expected to pay close attention, maybe write it down, confess it immediately, or go on a 3-day fast just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time trying to interpret dreams. Entire books were written to decode their complex meanings. Did you dream of fire? That could mean hell. Did you dream of water? That could mean purification or, ominously, drowning. Did you dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You had better call a priest right away and maybe think about moving. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams was very important because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That slightly embarrassing dream you had about stealing a loaf of bread? That might be your subconscious confessing your real-life gluttony. Or maybe you were just really hungry. But still, it was better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with their superiors. Some were praised for having holy visions during sleep. Others were gently advised to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams were not just spiritual puzzles. They were also great plot devices. Medieval literature is full of vivid dream sequences where knights meet angels, demons, or mysterious creatures who speak in poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, but with a lot more allegory and fewer happy endings. The church, as you might expect, was suspicious. Not all dreams were considered divine, and some were thought to be sent by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamed of something bad, it could mean your soul was under attack, or maybe you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in their beds. It is a cozy, though sometimes smelly, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, Sharing a bed with an animal was not a personal choice. It was mainly a practical way to stay warm. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes were not built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, and drafts so strong they probably had names of their own did little to keep in the heat. Central heating? That was more commonly known as the family pig. In peasant homes, it was completely normal for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed, and very often on the same large pile of straw. Chickens roamed freely, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snorted softly by the fire, and if you were lucky, none of them decided to bite you during the night. This was not mainly about affection, although medieval people certainly cared for their animals. It was about basic survival. Animals produced essential body heat. They were warm, reliable, and, unlike some relatives, did not hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner could raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in the middle of January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one multi-purpose room for everything. Cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, had to make do with the same limited space. Children might find themselves sleeping between their parents and a goat. A chicken might accidentally become an alarm clock. Hygiene? Let's not ask too many questions about that. For wealthier families, this was less common. Nobles usually did not sleep right next to livestock, though they might have had lapdogs in bed, not for warmth but as a fashion statement and a fun way to spread fleas. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favorite animals, because nothing showed power quite like a dog with its own room and title. There were, of course, downsides. Animals can be loud, they can wander around, and they are not known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in your face at 3 a.m.? Just a normal part of the bedtime routine. If you have ever accidentally fallen asleep while sitting up in a lecture, on a bumpy carriage ride, or in a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a stiff neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright was not an accident. For some, it was a deliberate choice. Certain medieval people, especially the wealthy or the very religious, chose to sleep propped up instead of lying flat. Why? For a few reasons, none of which were very good for getting a restful night's sleep. First, there was a common medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, lung function, or the overall balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors seriously thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this strange logic made perfect sense. They believed that sleeping upright helped to avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds serious but mainly meant, don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, there were major spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too similar to the posture of the dead. You definitely did not want to confuse God or, worse, get unwanted attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Was it superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest was also your health expert, you learned to pick your battles. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large pillows, bolsters, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval recliner. Nobles sometimes had their fancy beds set up with angled supports to keep them in a semi-seated position, which was thought to be perfect for digesting an evening meat pie or fighting off sudden demon attacks. Monks in stricter orders took this a step further. They might even sleep sitting straight up on a hard bench or leaning against a cold stone wall with only a hood to block out the discomfort. This was not about health, it was about strict discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this was not a way to get quality rest. It was mainly about virtue, discomfort, and some confusing theology. Forget about haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in their sheets. Small, persistent, and completely uninterested in your prayers. We are talking, of course, about the ever-present fleas, lice, and the unofficial, unwelcome mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bedbug. Let's be honest. Hygiene was not a strong point of medieval Europe. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from things you would rather not know about. Add to that straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional chicken wandering around, and you had the perfect setup for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were basically permanent roommates. Peasants dealt with them every day. Nobles, despite their fancy satin sheets and plush feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some wealthier households even had dedicated nitpickers, servants whose specific job was to carefully remove lice from their employer's hair and clothes. Imagine that as your job title, master of the royal scalp. Bedbugs, on the other hand, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They cleverly hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the tiny cracks in stone walls, coming out at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you have ever wondered why medieval people always wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it was not always just about warmth. Sometimes it was a basic form of armor against pests. Solutions to these infestations ranged from slightly effective to completely bizarre. Some households tried burning strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel the bugs. Others deliberately slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may not have done much to the pests but certainly kept romance at a minimum. It was not just physical discomfort either. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, serving as constant, biting reminders of the fall of man and, perhaps, poor bedding choices. Entire poems were even written about fleas, some with a moral tone, others strangely romantic because nothing says, "I love you," quite like the sentiment, "Let us be united," like the flea that bites us both. So, while modern sleep is usually interrupted by buzzing phones and bright streetlights, medieval sleep was far more likely to be disturbed by constant scratching, twitching, and the unsettling feeling that something was crawling on your leg, because it almost certainly was. We have all had restless nights, but have you ever tried to fall asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? Probably not. Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did just that, because apparently nothing says, "Sweet dreams," quite like being ready to joust in your sleep. Now, to be fair, most people, even knights, did not regularly sleep in full, heavy armor. It was hot, incredibly heavy, and very noisy. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is like trying to nap inside a bag of silverware. But during a war or in enemy territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer, wiser choice. Comfort was optional. Survival was highly recommended. A knight on a campaign might only take off his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case the enemy decided to throw a surprise midnight party. There is nothing quite like waking up to the sound of thundering hooves and having to put on your full suit of armor while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, soldiers might even sleep with their swords or axes right next to them, like a very aggressive security blanket. Shields often served as makeshift pillows, and if the enemy managed to break through the walls, well, at least you would not have to waste time getting dressed. Priorities were clear. Of course, sleeping in armor was not exactly restful. Iron is not breathable, and chainmail has a nasty habit of pinching the skin. Add to that cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you have a sleep environment that is less comfortable than an airport terminal. Even those not in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous areas. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, which were thick, quilted jackets that offered some protection and a little more padding than just the moral support of prayer. And let's not forget, armor was not quiet. If you accidentally rolled over the wrong way, you might make such a loud clanking noise that everyone else woke up, convinced the apocalypse had arrived. Again, in a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs sharing your bed were considered normal, you might think that sleepwalking was just another minor medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people did not think it was because of stress or exhaustion. They immediately assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had urgent, unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wanted to sound smart to the local monk, was not well understood and was often feared. The idea that someone could get up from their straw bed, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was seen less as a harmless sleep disorder and more as a devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest that people were genuinely scared of sleepwalkers. Imagine this unsettling scene. A man in a long nightshirt, carrying a candle, his eyes glazed and empty, mumbling Latin that he did not actually know while stepping over livestock. You would instinctively think, ghost, or heretic, or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by an imbalance of the bodily humors, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all explanation for anything they could not figure out. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body to wander around clumsily like an unattended mule. To prevent these strange nightly adventures, people tried all sorts of methods, from questionable herbal remedies to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or, in more rural areas, simply tying the sleepwalker's leg to a sturdy chair. If that sounds extreme, remember that some medieval homes had open fireplaces, dangerous knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically spilled. In a strange twist, there were persistent rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and debates about whether a person could commit a sin while they were unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered softly, or tried to open imaginary doors. But if someone accidentally sleepwalked into a church, locals might see it as a profound divine sign, or immediately call for a cleansing ritual just to be safe. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through absolute chaos. Church bells, violent thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional surprise siege. For the perpetually tired people of the Middle Ages, these were just background noises, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day. Sunrise, prayer times, meals, and, of course, the incredibly early hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were likely set to the soundtrack of constant, regular tolling. At some point, the brain just got used to it. The bells became a strange lullaby for an overslept, overscheduled soul. And it was not just bells. Storms were frequent and frightening. With no weather apps or double-glazed windows, you felt every clap of thunder as if the world might end at any moment. Roofs leaked, windows rattled violently, and chimneys howled like ghosts. Still, people managed to sleep. They had no other choice. Work did not stop for insomnia, and neither did plowing fields, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events were not always a reason to stay awake either. In the 14th century, people somehow continued to sleep through devastating famine, constant war, and even the terrifying Black Death. When the grim death carts rolled by in the morning, it was seen more as a sad wake-up call than a cause for widespread panic. And if you did not wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy. There are even historical records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and human bodies simply adapted. If you worked from sunup to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your waking hours avoiding mud, taxes, and eternal damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard. And then there were those who used sleep as a desperate escape. Faced with chronic illness, deep grief, or the overwhelming fear that the world was literally ending, which was predicted about every century, some people simply curled up under a cloak, mumbled a quick prayer, and took a deep nap. There is a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, the small village of Salem, Massachusetts, was covered in more than just snow. It was wrapped in a thick blanket of tension, deep suspicion, and a quiet, creeping fear that seeped into every home and frozen field. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict in their beliefs, deeply religious, and profoundly superstitious. They firmly believed they were building a holy community in the American wilderness. City on a hill, constantly watched by God and relentlessly hunted by Satan. Life was already incredibly difficult. The village had recently split from Salem town over bitter political and religious disputes. Crops had failed for several seasons. Smallpox had swept through nearby communities, leaving many traumatized. There was tension between neighbors, arguments over inheritance, and a deep resentment towards outsiders or anyone who did not quite fit in. Add to this volatile mix the long, dark, and freezing New England winter, and something was bound to break. That breaking point came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave in very strange ways. They screamed uncontrollably, threw objects with surprising force, and twisted their bodies into unnatural, disturbing positions. At times, they would be silent for hours, their eyes wide with what looked like terror. Neighbors began to whisper that the girls were cursed. The girls themselves claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, unsure what to do, called a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical reason for their problems, Griggs gave the devastating diagnosis that would throw the entire village into chaos: witchcraft. That single, terrifying word ignited the fears that were already simmering in Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not ridiculous. It was terrifyingly believable. And now, if the devil could find his way into the minister's own home, what did that mean for the rest of the vulnerable community? The girls, gently encouraged by both adults and their friends, began to name names. At first, they accused women on the edges of society, social outcasts and misfits. But soon, the accusations would chillingly spread to the respectable, the wealthy, and even the most pious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would be felt far beyond its borders. What began as fearful whispers in the dark would soon become agonized cries from the gallows and leave behind a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history books. Once the terrifying idea of witchcraft took hold in Salem, it spread like a creeping vine, quiet and subtle at first, then relentlessly choking everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like in Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow bolder and more dramatic with each passing day. They convulsed uncontrollably in court, screamed loudly during public prayers, and claimed they could see dark spirits hovering menacingly over certain villagers. This was not just childhood imagination. It was theatrical, very public, and most disturbingly widely believed. The first people to be accused were those with the least social protection, women who already lived on the fringes of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when people turned her away. They readily claimed her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe, she snapped at children. She perfectly fit the convenient stereotype of a witch because she did not fit the strict mold of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne had not been to church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who openly defied tradition, clearly suspicious. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, was considered the most exotic of all. Coming from Barbados, her captivating storytelling, different accent, and unfamiliar folklore frightened the villagers. Under immense pressure and possibly physical abuse, Tituba eventually confessed to practicing witchcraft. But instead of calming the tense atmosphere, her confession blew the situation wide open. She told a chilling story of a tall man dressed in black, a figure clearly associated with the devil, who forced her to sign a dark book. She claimed she saw strange, unsettling animals, bright yellow birds, menacing red cats, and even ghostly dogs. But most damning of all, she explicitly said that there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door to accusations, others eagerly rushed through it. New names were added every week. Neighbors turned viciously on neighbors. Old grudges were cleverly hidden behind righteous accusations. Property disputes mysteriously became spectral assaults. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's work. The fear became so infectious that not even the innocent dared to speak out, to defend an accused, which was to immediately bring suspicion on yourself. Silence became a desperate form of self-preservation. And so the web of accusations widened, relentlessly trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was fading fast. Hysteria was now firmly in control. As accusations continued to mount and the village reached a fever pitch of paranoia, the colonial government finally stepped in. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and eager to maintain order, created a special court to deal with the growing chaos. It was officially called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning, to hear and determine. But what it truly became was a factory for fear-driven, twisted justice. The court met in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary court. Its rules were warped by overwhelming panic. Instead of requiring solid evidence or reliable witnesses, it shockingly allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony claiming that a spirit or specter of the accused person had harmed the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream, choking them, that was considered admissible in court. It did not matter that the accused could have been sound asleep, at church, or miles away. Their spirit was supposedly doing the devil's evil work. You could not cross-examine a dream, and worse, you could not prove it did not happen. Children were now treated as key witnesses. Their dramatic seizures, piercing screams, and gasps in court became more theatrical with each passing day. One young girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into violent fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner dared to look at her, she shrieked. If they deliberately avoided looking at her, she shrieked even louder. These performances were so convincing that the judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all as real. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept did not exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood completely alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agony. If you confessed, you might be spared immediate death, but only if you named others as accomplices. The system perversely rewarded lies and severely punished silence. Worse still, the trials became disturbing public events. People traveled from nearby towns to watch. The accused were marched into court in heavy chains, often bewildered, poor, and almost always powerless. And yet, not everyone believed what was happening. Some townspeople quietly whispered that the girls were faking their fits. Others wondered why only certain types of people were being accused. But few dared to speak out openly. To question the court was to question the will of God. In Salem, reason had been completely set aside, and the law had become a distorted reflection of fear, not impartial justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy target. She wore brightly colored red clothes, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years before. During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit had pinched them in the night, that their babies had mysteriously died after she walked by, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She firmly denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was then led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept piece of land just outside Salem. There was no final prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled. The crowd watched in grim silence, and with that single execution, the terrifying machine of death began to turn relentlessly. The next hangings happened quickly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of these women had a good standing in the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman who was beloved in the community. Even the jury initially found her not guilty, but under immense pressure from the court and the constantly afflicted girls, the verdict was tragically overturned. Nurse's final, haunting words were whispered like a chilling warning. "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it did not matter anymore. The noose did not care. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had expressed doubts about the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met an even more horrific end. Giles stoically refused to enter a plea. The court, unable to hold a trial without a plea, used an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Heavy stones were piled on his chest, slowly and cruelly, over 3 agonizing days. His final words, as legend has it, were, "More weight." By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in jail while waiting for their trial. Dozens had falsely confessed in a desperate attempt to save their lives. Over 200 people in total were accused. The gallows cast long, dark shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but deep in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been mercilessly led to its death. While the public executions got all the attention, hundreds of other accused people languished in cramped, smelly jails, desperately waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small local jail could not hold them all. Accused witches were held in nearby towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to cold walls, starving, freezing, and mostly forgotten. Most of the accused were not actually witches or even social outcasts. They were ordinary neighbors, friends, parents, and children, people whose only crime was having an argument with the wrong person or owning land that someone else wanted. In many cases, personal grudges disguised as divine justice were the real reason for the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and suddenly died? It must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood? Clearly, they had cursed the axe. Mary Easty, the sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such sad case. She was a respected mother of 7, known for her piety. She was initially released by the court because there was not enough evidence, but she was rearrested just days later after new, dramatic fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final, heartbreaking letter to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but to put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. She was hanged soon after. Another notable case was Dorothy Good, the innocent 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother was arrested, Dorothy was interrogated and, under immense pressure, allegedly confessed to being a witch. Her answers, a mix of childish nonsense and deep fear, were chillingly taken as truth. She was imprisoned for 8 agonizing months in chains. When she was finally released, she was mentally broken and never fully recovered from the trauma. Pregnant women were not spared either. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later be hanged, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was mercifully delayed. This delay likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials ended. Accusations snowballed relentlessly. Some accused people confessed in desperation to avoid certain death, and then, in turn, named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Entire families were tragically pulled into the escalating spiral. Fathers, wives, daughters. No one was truly safe from the accusations. Meanwhile, the jails became overcrowded. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly among the prisoners. Some died while waiting for their trial, lost in the cruel legal limbo of paranoia. And still, new names were added every week. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to loudly accuse you. By the fall of 1692, the terrifying spell of hysteria began to break. Not because the court suddenly regained its senses, but because reality forced its way in. The turning point came when the accusations became too bold. People who had once supported the trials found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the accusations. Reverend George Burroughs, a former beloved Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, articulate, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That, apparently, was enough to accuse him. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood calmly on the gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed to be incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent in disbelief. Some wept openly. Even hardened observers were shaken. But the execution went on anyway. That moment planted a powerful seed of doubt. Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the very top of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already nervous about growing public criticism and the escalating chaos, finally took action. In October 1692, he officially dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, effectively stopping all pending executions and trials. Public opinion had shifted dramatically. Ministers, who had once been silent or complicit, began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, publicly condemned the unreliable use of spectral evidence. "It were better," he famously declared, "that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This was a radical thought in a society that had, for months, believed the exact opposite. People who had once cheered for the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the appetite for more blood had visibly faded. Too many respected people were now being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to realize that this was not divine justice. It was sheer madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers began to take back their statements. Others simply disappeared from public view. And those who had shouted the loudest now quietly looked away. The fear had not disappeared, but it had finally worn itself out. The public wanted stability. The officials desperately tried to save face. And Salem, bruised and deeply ashamed, was finally ready to wake up from its terrifying nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the devastating damage had already been done. By late 1692, the very legal system that had relentlessly fueled the hysteria began to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. With the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, a new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time, things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed as testimony, and the judges were noticeably more skeptical of the accuser's wild claims. The result? The rate of convictions dropped dramatically. Many accused, witches, were acquitted. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, the majority of the accused were released. Even those who had previously confessed began to recant their testimonies, admitting that fear, torture, or intense pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic, theatrical performances of the afflicted girls lost their persuasive power. The most prominent case in the unraveling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a highly respected minister who himself came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the fact that such a high-ranking, devout man could be suspected showed how arbitrary and corrupt the whole process had become. The court, once so zealous, was now hesitant. They began quietly releasing those still in jail, first those with little evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. Meanwhile, the families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned the government for the return of his confiscated property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a determined campaign to clear her name. In time, deep community shame gradually replaced the community fear. Church congregations were irrevocably broken. Lifelong friendships were destroyed. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been completely torn apart. Governor Phipps, recognizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, issued pardons for the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even this new freedom came at a price. Many families were forced to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 had died in jail, and over 200 had been formally accused. The court did not just collapse. It spectacularly imploded, leaving behind a deep crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials were over, but the agonizing healing process had not even begun. Salem was a village forever changed by the innocent people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the harsh mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows stood silent, the jails had emptied, but Salem was far from peaceful. The town was not haunted by vengeful ghosts, but by an oppressive, pervasive guilt. What had started with a few seemingly sick girls had exploded into a devastating act of communal destruction. Families had been torn apart, reputations ruined, and innocent lives cruelly ended. And now the survivors had to live with the wreckage. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. The same people who once prayed together had testified viciously against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town. Others simply faded from public view. A few, notably and Putnam Jr., would later express deep remorse. In 1706, she courageously stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming her actions on delusion by Satan. But for many, the damage was beyond words. The court officials, too, carried their own heavy burden. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was one of the very few to publicly admit he was wrong. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read his confession and fervent prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of real accountability in a time when most people just tried to forget. But forgetting was not easy. The families of the condemned began demanding compensation and a formal apology. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, asking for official pardons, the return of confiscated property, and public acknowledgement that the executed were innocent. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered limited financial compensation to their heirs. But even that was not enough. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left out completely. Whispers of witchcraft never completely disappeared from New England, but in Salem, the deep shame became a part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps as a desperate attempt to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the agonizing memory of what had happened. But the memory persisted in sermons, in stories, in the uncomfortable silence between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by overwhelming fear, by destructive pride, and by unchecked power. And that curse would linger long after the executions had finally stopped. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to echo powerfully, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we understand justice, the insidious nature of fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 was not just a strange episode of mass hysteria. It was a catastrophic breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of widespread panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, even ministers, became unwitting executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, which were supposed to protect the innocent, became terrifying tools of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony became a theatrical performance, and silence was seen as guilt. One of the most chilling things about Salem's tragedy is how quickly it happened. In just a matter of months, fear completely triumphed over fact. Old grudges, disguised as spiritual warfare, quickly became death sentences. It did not require actual demons or devils. It only required a widespread, fervent belief in them. But the trials also taught hard-earned, invaluable lessons that would ripple through American society for years and centuries to come. The Salem episode would be repeatedly cited in crucial debates about due process and civil liberties. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit practices that had unjustly doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantee of a right to legal counsel, the right to face one's accusers, and the strict requirement for concrete evidence were hard-won principles forged, in part, from the tragic ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase, witch hunt, has become a common shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it is often used with little regard for the real terror and suffering those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a real town where innocent people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: fear, when left unchecked, can become its own form of tyranny. And when that fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials stand as a stark cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when fear is given too much authority. The gallows may be long gone, the courtrooms now quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself, unless we carefully remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite, yet slightly eccentric Fulvii family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper ranks of Roman politics. Though not one of the oldest patrician families, the Fulvii had produced esteemed consuls, formidable generals, and eloquent speakers. Their family line carried both intense ambition and a distinct taste for causing trouble. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his stumbling speech than for his political achievements. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia? She was no stammerer. She was undeniably born to lead. From a young age, Fulvia would have been constantly surrounded by the sharp-edged, ruthless world of Roman power. Senators and generals frequently debated important policies in her home. News of elections and betrayals were daily events. She would have keenly observed how politics was not just played out in the Roman Forum, but was intricately woven into marriages, funerals, whispered rumors, and secret backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were typically expected to be quiet, supportive partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would defy all of those expectations. She was independently wealthy, highly educated, and exceptionally well-connected, and she knew it. While her early life is not well documented, her later actions strongly suggest a young woman who was remarkably observant, politically savvy, and completely unafraid. This was not someone who quietly faded into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and an unwavering will to act, even in the male-dominated world of Roman government. This was also a time of unprecedented instability in Rome. The Republic was rapidly falling apart. Civil wars, populist revolts, and brutal power struggles between powerful generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a volatile pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia came of age in the middle of this chaos. Instead of shrinking from the disorder, Fulvia learned to manipulate it. Her early life experiences did not produce the kind of modest woman Rome typically idealized. Instead, they produced a powerful woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be conquered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical, key player in Roman history. But Fulvia would not just marry into power. She would actively command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on a coin, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome was not ready for Fulvia, but she was definitely ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but traditional. Clodius was not an ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist troublemaker, a political firestarter with a flair for chaos, public scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was a dangerous, disruptive force. To the Roman masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he represented a major strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had effectively turned the Roman Republic into his own chaotic stage. Clodius was famous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had once notoriously disguised himself as a woman to sneak into a sacred, female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, a scandal that only seemed to make him more popular. He later controversially gave up his patrician status to run for tribune of the plebs, an office that gave him immense veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's complex street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive, quiet wife, was right there beside him. She was not a silent partner. Roman sources strongly suggest that Fulvia was actively involved in her husband's tumultuous political world. She engaged directly with his supporters, was visibly present during his public campaigns, and managed their household as a central hub for his political activities. Together, they were a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But this powerful alliance came at a devastating price. In 52 BCE, Clodius was brutally murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, deliberately showing his bloody wounds for maximum emotional impact. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had brilliantly turned personal grief into a powerful public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it was devastatingly effective. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as a strategic tool, and wield her dead husband's legacy as a weapon established her as a new, formidable player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of his shadow, and Rome would never see her in the same way again. Fulvia did not spend a long time in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a notoriously short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for public drama. But underneath the bravado was a shrewd and capable politician. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio had enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic was teetering between civil war and fragile peace, caught between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a strategic bridge to the next rising power group. This was not a romantic rebound. It was a carefully calculated political alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia desperately needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry on the populist legacy her first husband had built, and someone who had Julius Caesar's backing. Curio perfectly met both requirements. Through him, Fulvia remained deeply involved in the ever-shifting power dynamics of Rome. She did not just marry into the political movement, she actively helped shape it. Fulvia made sure that Clodius's supporters remained active and organized, cleverly rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. But the Roman world was rapidly collapsing. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey escalated into a full-blown civil war. Curio immediately joined the conflict, siding with Caesar. Fulvia, as always, remained deeply politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and managed vital resources for her husband's military campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's strategic position. But it ended in disaster. He was ambushed and brutally killed by the forces of King Juba I of Numidia. His death was exceptionally brutal, and his army was completely wiped out. Once again, Fulvia was a widow, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would finally fade into the background. She did not. Curio's death only solidified her status as a formidable political widow with dangerous resilience. She had now tragically lost two husbands to Rome's constant civil unrest, and both had died fighting for powerful populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership, and her most dramatic, defining chapter, was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, around 47 BCE, was not just a romantic attachment. It was a calculated merger of immense power. Fulvia had already proven herself a master of Roman street politics and public opinion. Antony, rapidly rising through the military and political ranks, desperately needed that kind of savvy support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically powerful and influential couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to the harsh realities of bloodshed and betrayal. She had buried two husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to public scandal either. He drank heavily, gambled excessively, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than just entertain him. She could fiercely defend his interests, hold his complex alliances together, and rally supporters when he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his often brash exterior, clearly understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise a level of authority that no Roman woman had ever publicly held before. She opened his mail, issued orders in his absence, sat in on crucial political meetings, and directly influenced appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile to her, often depicted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what truly disturbed them was not her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no framework for such a powerful woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony swiftly moved to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, but it was Fulvia who effectively held Rome itself. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia served as his representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized. She even helped arrange Antony's reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Clodia, to him, an alliance that would later dramatically fall apart. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his powerful proxy. Roman coins were even minted bearing both Antony's image and her own name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status and political agency. She was not in the shadows of power. She stood in its full, blazing light. But power in Rome was always borrowed, and Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Mark Antony was pursuing military campaigns and political deals across the vast Roman world, it was Fulvia who effectively controlled the streets of Rome. She was not just his wife. She was his de facto regent in everything but name. In a period where violence, bribery, and personal influence maintained a semblance of order, Fulvia proved she could play the ruthless political game as skillfully as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome after Caesar's assassination was a chaotic battlefield without swords. Power was a constantly moving target. Fulvia understood this and anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She expertly directed allies, dealt with the urban masses, negotiated with factions, and waged an intense war with words and money. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to maintain public order, and ensured that any new laws favored Antony's ambitions. Some ancient sources, particularly hostile ones like Appian and Cassius Dio, portray Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even a warmonger. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies the truth of a woman actively doing politics in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions normally reserved for male senators and consuls. She also made public appearances and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a vital group in the power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning in the East, Fulvia was often the public face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and constantly reminding soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly those aligned with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and Antony's growing rival, deeply resented Fulvia's influence. They saw her as a meddling, aggressive woman who held too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented. Fulvia was not naive. She saw that the tension between Antony and Octavian was escalating. She could see their uneasy alliance was fracturing. And she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Roman Republic was not big enough for both of them. So Fulvia began preparing for the next phase. Not diplomacy, but direct confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she was ready to seize it herself. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus. And she did not do it quietly. With her husband, Mark Antony, still in the East, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's growing authority in Italy. The official reason? To defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's hand was clear. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would provoke and organize a full-blown civil war. The resulting conflict, known as the Perusine War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced many Italian citizens to reward his own soldiers. Fulvia seized on the public discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and a betrayer of Caesar's legacy. With Lucius as her public face and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized control of the city of Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was far more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, incited the public, and even corresponded directly with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions and issuing orders. Octavian, though initially surprised, acted swiftly. He besieged Perugia through the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, trapped with dwindling food and escalating betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a gesture to avoid alienating Antony, but Fulvia was immediately exiled. The formidable woman who had once commanded riots, arranged marriages, and influenced armies was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony did not come rushing to her side. The once powerful alliance had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had ever done before, wage a civil war. And now the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from the heart of Rome, Fulvia arrived in Sicyon, a Greek city that had become a sort of purgatory for failed power players. She had gone to war not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. She believed she was defending Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and their shared vision for Rome. But what awaited her in exile was not a hero's welcome. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything. Her status, her alliances, her very life. And yet, Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romance had fully blossomed or was just beginning, the symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions and enduring a siege, Antony was raising goblets at lavish banquets next to a foreign queen. The betrayal was not just personal, but political. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he effectively abandoned her. Some ancient historians, like Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for starting the Perusine War without his direct approval. Others argue he secretly welcomed her downfall. It conveniently cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never have tolerated. Still, Fulvia was not entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, who remained loyal to her, urged a reconciliation. But her health was already failing. After enduring a siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness, stress, or a broken heart. She was about 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly after and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a new peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their plans, was finally gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth would nearly erase every other powerful Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She did not wield power from behind a curtain. She marched directly into it, stood at its center, and dared to command armies in a male-dominated world that treated women like furniture. Rome did not know how to deal with her, so it tried to erase her from history. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, the powerful men she had once maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet, deliberate work of rewriting her legacy. She could no longer defend herself, so the narrative was shaped by her enemies and the survivors of her ambition. And like so many powerful women throughout history, Fulvia became a convenient scapegoat. Ancient sources, written mainly by men with political interests, painted her as the sole reason for the devastating Perusine War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general disorder of the Republic. Appian, Cassius Dio, and Plutarch consistently depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by an insatiable lust for power. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into the conflict, for antagonizing Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia operated in a brutal political climate where violence and manipulation were not only accepted but expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would prove to be. Her only real crime was being a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome had no way to process or accept that. She was not confined to the home, quietly weaving or serving as a political ornament. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and commanding loyalty from troops. And that made her dangerous not just to Octavian but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic cleansing. Her memory became the price of his political survival. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no elaborate funeral, no public mourning speeches, just silence. Yet her enemies could not erase her completely. Fulvia had achieved too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a deity, but as a direct political agent. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men who tried to define her. Fulvia's story may end in historical silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place her within Rome's grand narrative, because Fulvia shattered every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She did not just advise power from the shadows. She became power, and that fact made her both unforgettable and unsettling to a deeply patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispered suggestions and strategic marriages, Fulvia shouted through policy decisions, warfare, and political theater. She was not just a consort, she was a commander, and yet, she was remembered more for her defiance and audacity than for her accomplishments. Roman historians could not reconcile a woman who refused to stay in her place, so they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But read between the lines of their biased accounts, and a different figure emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins bearing her own name. She skillfully organized political factions, used marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BCE not as a bystander, but as a central, active player, a woman whose influence genuinely terrified senators and shaped the fate of powerful triumvirs. Her downfall was not due to incompetence. It was due to unfortunate timing and, primarily, her gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy lingered. Later Roman women, such as Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, would all operate in various ways in the shadow Fulvia helped create. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession. But Fulvia did it first, and without an imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer just a cautionary tale, she is increasingly recognized as one of the most politically active and influential women in Roman history, someone who tested the boundaries of female power and paid the price for it. She did not just exist in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them directly. And while Rome may have tried to erase her from memory, Fulvia left her fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote, but a force. A woman undeniably centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two different worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression and another yearning to be free. In the American Deep South, racial segregation was not just a social norm, it was enforced by law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, public buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant, lynchings still occurred, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were met with police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it was not asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance and resilience. The March on Washington was not conceived in a single conversation. It was the result of escalating frustration combined with fierce hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting for justice. They were demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most: the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been around for decades. Philip Randolph, a veteran labor organizer and civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, its purpose was to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt signed an executive order addressing the issue. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other prominent civil rights leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they were not just marching for jobs. They were marching for human dignity, voting rights, school desegregation, equal pay, and the basic right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it, despite their internal disagreements, because they understood the power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized. Flyers were spreading. Word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers. And across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most pivotal moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one determined footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest in Washington, D.C. was no small task, but planning one for over 100,000 people was an act of sheer madness. Logistically, it seemed like a nightmare. Securing food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, permits, crowd control, and safety plans. And yet, somehow, they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept in the background for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin had studied nonviolence under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and continuously watched by the FBI. But nothing seemed to faze him. He saw the March on Washington as an opportunity to show the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team turned the idea into a reality. The march was officially titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was framed to encompass both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was intentional. While Dr. King would become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who ensured the demands were equally focused on addressing unemployment, advocating for a minimum wage, and championing workers' rights, as much as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were deeply nervous. They feared riots, a violent backlash, or bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby, D.C. hospitals were on high alert, and liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even advised they could stay home. And then there was the question of internal unity. The Big Six, civil rights organizations NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics. Some wanted more radical action, others preferred more diplomatic engagement. SNCC's young members were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach. But they all agreed on one thing: The time for silence was over. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker's time was timed to the minute. Every route had marshals trained in crowd control. They were not just planning a march. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was intensely hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin. But it did not stop them. From every corner of the country they came. Black individuals, white individuals, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best. Others clutched handmade protest signs. They arrived by bus, train, carpool, and even on foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots, the scene was astonishingly calm and orderly. Volunteers directed traffic with precision. The Red Cross handed out water. Groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of "Jobs and Freedom" echoing off the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities also joined the event. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd remained orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this was not just a protest. It was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the mall felt like a quiet revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to declare, "We are here," in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone. It was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. At noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, representing different organizations, ideologies, and regions, but all united in their core message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang with soul-stirring power. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands under the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when he finally did, the world would stop, listen, and forever remember. The march was not just making history. It was becoming legend, minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the vast crowd had fallen into a profound quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was about to happen. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neat tie, and an expression of calm that barely concealed the fire within him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember was not what was typed. It was what flowed from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he stated, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, "The Negro is still not free." His resonant voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence as instruments of persuasion. The crowd listened intently, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the event and the trajectory of the civil rights movement. Standing behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson. She suddenly cried out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he had delivered before, but never with this impact. "I have a dream," he declared, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase resonated louder and more resolute than the last. "I have a dream that one day, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was no longer just a speech. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King concluded with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted in applause, tears, and shouts of joy. They knew they had witnessed more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington was not just in the speeches or the music. It was in the people themselves. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and every other state. Some were seasoned activists. Others had never left their hometowns until this day. They packed lunches, endured 20-hour bus rides, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steelworkers, who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses to history. They did not just want change. They were the change. There were also many children in the crowd. Young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys holding hand-drawn signs. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial and hear the speakers' voices over loudspeakers. To them, this was not just an event. It was the dawn of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery that senior leaders asked him to tone it down just minutes before he went on stage. He reluctantly agreed, but his call for radical change still resonated. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, reading a prepared statement for other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message highlighted a harsh reality. Even within a movement for equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students from every background. They did not all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolent approach. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant stance. But for that one day, those differences dissolved. Unity triumphed. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity. Freedom now. Buttons pinned to chests. And the collective sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd were not just watching history. They were shaping it. And none of them would ever forget what they had witnessed. While the world saw unity and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What appeared to be a perfectly synchronized movement was held together by willpower, sweat, and last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the brilliant architect of the march, had to deal not only with complex logistics but also with treacherous internal politics. He was under intense scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King did not remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of the planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to give major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was there, revered by all, but she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful image of the march lay an uncomfortable truth. The movement itself still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction simmered. SNCC leaders were growing disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations. But unity was deemed too important, at least for that one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, shadowed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing of the sort happened, they redoubled their surveillance, particularly targeting Dr. King. And let's not forget the financial cost. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also profoundly human. Imperfect, messy, political, and ultimately unfinished, just like the country it sought to heal. The sun began its slow descent behind the Washington Monument as the crowds gradually dispersed. People embraced, cried, sang freedom songs, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered, the signs raised, and the world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the August air. What happens next? In the days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some outlets called it orderly and dignified, which was thinly veiled code for no one rioted. Few publications dedicated much space to the specific economic demands of the march, such as the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech, that at least could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the march, watched it on television with growing admiration and surprise. He publicly called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House afterward. But legislative action remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was stalled in Congress, held up by Southern opposition. Some activists were deeply disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate, tangible action. Instead, it was back to the relentless grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who had paid the ultimate price. Just weeks later, that reality struck hard. On September 15, 1963, four innocent black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, but the nightmare was far from over. Still, something profound had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, impactful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a broader coalition than ever before. Labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all united by the cause of justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a resonant voice, an inspiring dream, a powerful speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world for generations to come. The march was over, but the road was just beginning. And that road would soon lead through bloodshed, transformative legislation, and profound societal change. The March on Washington did not just shake the conscience of America. It reshaped its moral landscape. What began as an audacious protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march did not yield immediate victories, but it created irresistible momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In 1965, the pivotal Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech he delivered that day propelled him into a new realm of influence. He went from a respected leader to a global icon. But such fame came with a heavy cost. Increased surveillance, constant threats, and ultimately, his tragic assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It provided a blueprint for large-scale mobilization and inspired a generation of activists, both in the US and internationally. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders would all cite the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy extends beyond historical impact. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I have a dream," all of it still pulses through modern protest movements. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, the spirit of 1963 reverberates with every chant and every sign. In Washington, D.C. today, King's Memorial stands across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his likeness carved in stone, with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial is not just in stone. It lives in classrooms, in voting booths, in protests, and in countless voices refusing to stay silent. Because the dream was never meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools, his voice echoing in the national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question persists. Has the dream been realized or merely delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now facing new assaults, were won through bloodshed, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal, is now protected by federal law. These are not small accomplishments. They are monumental victories carved out by relentless struggle. And yet, the original demands of the march, those often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain deeply entrenched. Police brutality, the issue that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color, is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the end. It was a critical flashpoint, a stake driven into the ground that declared, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but alive. Whether it is ultimately deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past, but on us. On the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again, until the dream truly becomes a shared, lived reality for all.